At 9:47 p.m., when the phone rang, I already knew exactly what was coming. It wasn't some wild guess or a sudden gut feeling. It was because my mother had called me just 23 minutes earlier. Her voice had been completely steady, every single word carefully chosen. She delivered each detail with the exact same calm precision she always used whenever things got ugly. No screaming, no breaking down. It was the quiet confidence of a woman who had decided decades ago that she would never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her sweat. She told me exactly where she was. She explained step by step how they had taken her there. She described the letter Marcus had handed her that morning at the Cape House up in Maine. It was on official stationery, complete with my full name, my professional title, and my Boston office address. She described the intake forms at the State Assessment Center for Adult Care. She described how the clerk's pen moved across the paper as my husband stood right next to her, speaking my name to a government worker as if it belonged to him. Then she said, "I didn't make a scene at Julian's house. I would never do that." I told her I understood completely. She said, "Fix it, sweetheart. Clean this mess up." Then she hung up. So, when Marcus's voice finally came through the receiver 23 minutes later, that calm, smooth, rehearsed tone didn't surprise me at all. It was the exact voice men use when they are giving a speech about a plan they think they just perfected. I wasn't listening to get information. I was watching a performance. I let him finish every single sentence. He talked about the special arrangements he had made and the top-tier care he had supposedly locked in for my mother. He casually mentioned that his brother and sister-in-law were already moving into the Cape House, getting settled for what he called a summer rental renovation. He said all of this with the absolute certainty of a man who truly believed the game was already over. I laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, and there wasn't a single bit of anger in it that he could detect or use against me. It was just the private chuckle of a woman watching a man walk through a door he could never walk back out of. You see, that Cape House in Maine never belonged to me. It was never in my name, and it was never part of my trust assets. The title belonged entirely to Vance Frontier Capital, a private entity my husband had never bothered to look into during our entire 4 years of marriage. He had just moved his brother's family into a house that had absolutely nothing to do with me. He had used my name fraudulently to pull it off, and he had gone out of his way to call my hotel room in Seattle just to rub it in my face. Before I tell you what happened next, if you are reading this late at night, early in the morning, or whenever you stumbled across it, I want you to know something. My name is Evelyn. I spent over 30 years building a life that no one could ever take away from me. That didn't happen because I got lucky. It happened because I knew how to watch closely at the right moments, and I knew how to keep my mouth shut at even better ones. Marcus had been staring at my family's wealth for 2 straight years. He charted it, he calculated it, and he built a whole strategy around it that he thought was brilliant. But there was one thing he never did, not even once. He never looked past my name to see the people standing right behind me. He never saw the relationships, the history, and the deep bonds that were built long before I was even born. Those things had nothing to do with the assets listed under my name, but they had everything to do with what I meant to the people who actually mattered. He thought the Cape House was his opening move in a grand endgame. In reality, he had just handed me his own execution order. I told him I heard him, and then I hung up the phone. I sat there in total silence for exactly 90 seconds. It wasn't because of shock, and it wasn't because of sadness. It was because Arthur had taught me that the most dangerous thing a woman can do in a crisis is move before she is completely ready. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had known by heart since I was a little girl. It picked up on the second ring. Arthur's people always answer the phone. To the rest of the world, our marriage looked respectable, solid, and warm. It looked exactly like a model marriage between 2 successful 40-something professionals in the Boston finance and architecture scenes should look. But the version I was living was a completely different story. 14 months into our marriage, we were having Sunday dinner at my mother's place at the Cape House in Maine. That night, Marcus was everything he was supposed to be. He was attentive and deeply respectful, playing the exact version of himself that he always put on whenever he was around Arthur and Eleanor. He knew how to perform for my parents. He studied them the exact same way he studied anything else he wanted to get something out of. At one point, Arthur casually mentioned the property. It wasn't even a main topic of conversation, just a passing remark. It was the way a man talks about something that has been in his life for so long that it doesn't even need an introduction. He mentioned that the landscaping team Julian set up would be coming by before the end of the month to check on things, and that Eleanor had already told them what she wanted to plant along the south wall. Marcus's focus shifted instantly. The change wasn't dramatic, and nobody else at the table would have even noticed it. It was just a sudden tightening, a sharp look that stayed on his face for less than 2 seconds before he smoothed it over and put his warm, attentive mask back on. He casually asked if Julian Vance's tech venture firm was still handling the family's tax management. Arthur looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Julian is an old friend, always has been." He moved the conversation along with that signature, easy grace of his. It was the effortless pivot of a man who had seen enough of the world to quietly sidestep anything he didn't want to talk about. Marcus just smiled, didn't push it, and reached for his wine glass. I saw the whole thing happen. I watched him file that piece of information away. I saw something deep in his eyes go incredibly still and deliberate. It was the stillness of a man who had just locked onto something he had been searching for, even if he didn't quite know what it looked like yet. That moment mattered because it wasn't the first thing I had noticed. Before that, there had been dozens of tiny moments. There were probing questions about properties that weren't in my name, an unusual interest in estate planning that didn't involve him, and a habit of only remembering details about assets while completely forgetting details about people. None of those things meant much on their own. But that night, for the very first time, the pattern lined up perfectly, and I saw right through him. Something inside me went still too, but for a completely different reason. I didn't say a word that night. When I kissed my parents goodbye, my posture, my expression, and the warmth in my voice didn't change at all. I drove back to Boston with Marcus, listening to him talk about the scenery, the food, and how great my mother looked. I responded exactly like a loving, supportive wife. Meanwhile, right then and there, I made a decision that I would never announce to a single soul. 11 days later, I called Sarah Lynn. It wasn't to give orders, just to talk. It was the kind of conversation a woman has when she needs the person who has handled her family's legal history for over a decade to understand a pattern she is quietly watching. It was a pattern that might need to be documented legally if it kept going. Sarah listened. She asked 2 questions. Then she told me she would update the file. 8 months after that dinner, Arthur passed away. Marcus grieved with absolute perfection. He said all the right things at the memorial service. He maintained the perfect, respectful silence right next to Eleanor. He showed the exact right amount of deference to a room packed full of union leaders and local builders who had loved and respected my father for decades. He was incredibly good at it. I stood right by his side, accepting condolences, and I noted every single detail. Over the next few weeks, something inside him loosened up. He stopped being so careful. He started asking questions he never would have dared to ask while Arthur was still alive. He asked about the trust structures, the inheritance timelines, and exactly what I was getting and when. I answered every single question accurately, but I never gave him the full picture. I told him the trusts were massive. I told him they had been set up a very long time ago. But I never said a single word about the protection clauses, the fact that they were irrevocable, or the names of the legal entities that held them. He only heard what he wanted to hear. I just let him. The file Sarah kept on Marcus was started 11 days after that dinner at the Cape House. That was 14 months before he finally made his move, and it was 18 months before he would realize exactly what that file was going to cost him. My father never told anyone what he owned. He never bragged about the money, the influence, or the kind of capital that belongs to a man who spent his whole life building things meant to outlast him. He just let his work speak for itself. That was Arthur. That was always Arthur. The neighborhoods in South Boston knew him the way people know someone who works quietly in the background, by the things left behind when they look up. Like the community arts center that suddenly appeared on an empty lot one spring, quietly maintained and wide open to everyone, without a single name or sign on it. Or the young apprentices who showed up at the back door of his woodshop every summer, arriving with a deep, unspoken confusion and leaving by the fall with a kind of resilience they couldn't even name yet, but would spend the rest of their lives building on. Julian Vance was only 16 years old the first time he showed up at that back door. He hadn't come looking for a job, wisdom, or anything else Arthur usually gave out. He was running from the police. He had been kicked out of his house for 3 days after getting into trouble at an abandoned construction site. Arthur's shop offered safety, a place where Julian didn't have to explain himself, and where he didn't have to feel the heavy weight of charity. Arthur didn't see ambition when he looked at Julian. Boston was full of ambition, and most of it never amounted to anything. What Arthur saw in Julian was a memory. It was a specific, sharp kind of memory for what people did for him, completely free of cheap sentimentality. It was a structural decision, not an emotional one, to treat a favor as something sacred that had to be paid back with actions instead of words. Arthur taught him how to draw architectural blueprints and how to understand load-bearing structures right there on the old sawdust-covered tables in the shop. Then, quietly and strategically, without ever forcing anything, he started connecting him to resources. He acted like a careful gardener, putting water right at the roots, just enough for the plant to take in, but never enough to drown it. Julian started out slow, but then he exploded at a speed that shocked everyone watching. Everyone except Arthur, because he had seen that memory in Julian from the very beginning. He knew exactly what a mind like that could build if it just had enough time and the right foundation. His rise wasn't easy. His first tech startup went bankrupt within 2 years. A partner he trusted pulled out maliciously, wiping out most of the savings he had worked so hard to scrap together. During those years, the success the outside world saw was a far cry from the brutal reality he was actually living. Arthur knew all about those years, because Julian still came by the shop, still sat at that old table, still asked questions, and still listened. Most people only remember the final result, completely forgetting the massive distance between the beginning and the end. Arthur never forgot. Vance Frontier Capital was incorporated after 10 years of steady growth, turning into a massive entity with major venture capital and tech real estate holdings in Silicon Valley, Seattle, and London. By the time it grew big enough for the heavy hitters in those circles to start paying attention, Arthur had already been retired for 7 years. Julian had gone back to the very wood shop where it all started. He sat across from Arthur at that exact same old table and told him he wanted to build something for him and Eleanor. He wanted to make something permanent, something that could hold all the gratitude he couldn't quite find the words to say. Arthur turned him down. He told Julian it was just too expensive, that they already had everything they could ever need. He said that seeing the man Julian had become was all the payback he would ever want. Julian let him finish. Then he said, "When I had nowhere to go, you gave me a roof over my head and you never once asked if it was too expensive. Now get in the car." The Cape House property in Maine was bought by Vance Frontier Capital and spent the next year and a half being completely rebuilt. The title belonged to the company, and Julian made it very clear that this wasn't some tax loophole or a legal shield. He said the house was a gift that stood for everything the company represented, and it deserved to be held that way forever. Arthur and Eleanor were given a formal life tenancy agreement. It was a legal document that gave them the unconditional right to live on the property until the end of their days. After Arthur passed, that right transferred solely to Eleanor. It didn't cost them a dime, and nobody had the power to revoke it except for Julian's own board of directors. And Julian was the chairman of that board, a position he was never going to give up. Marcus had heard the word estate, and his mind did the rest. He saw a prime piece of coastal Maine real estate. He saw Eleanor's perfectly manicured gardens, my father's library full of antique books, and the deep, historic comfort radiating from the house. He just assumed the rest. He assumed absolutely everything wrong. On the evening of their very first day moving in, Eleanor walked out to the iron garden gate and slowly placed her hand on it. She touched it the way you touch something you can't quite believe is real. Arthur stood right behind her, saying absolutely nothing. He never needed to say much of anything. Until I turned 20, I had always called him Uncle Julian. That was the year my mother and I were sitting in the kitchen at the Cape House, and I finally asked a question that had been bouncing around my head for a long time. I asked her why we loved him like he was actual blood. It wasn't some performance of family. It was the real thing. It was the patience, the specific kind of grace, and a loyalty that required no upkeep, no explanations, and never faded with distance or time. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, not because she was looking for an answer, but because she was deciding if I was ready for the weight of it. Then she said, "Because he never forgot. And people who never forget are a lot rarer than blood relatives." From that day on, I stopped calling him Uncle Julian. It wasn't because I cared about him any less, but because something much more accurate took its place. He had earned the right to step past those honorary titles we give people just to force closeness. Calling him Julian was the most honest thing I could offer. He never made a single comment about the change. That was just who he was. I grew up watching him move through our house with a quiet precision that had nothing to do with showing off. He never showed up empty-handed, but he never brought generic gifts either. He knew exactly what architecture history book Arthur was reading that month. He knew the specific old clock part Eleanor had mentioned in a casual phone call 3 weeks back. It was never a guess. It was incredibly specific. He knew what I was majoring in, the hurdles I was facing, and he always offered exactly what I needed in a way that felt like a solid investment in my future. I never once felt the heavy burden of receiving charity. He built Vance Frontier Capital across 3 continents in just 20 years, but he never turned into the kind of man who needed to brag about how far he had come. Silicon Valley was the headquarters, London handled the European data centers, and Seattle managed the Pacific Rim portfolio. He traveled like a man who viewed flights as pure work rather than a status symbol. He was full of purpose, entirely free of vanity, and no matter what time zone he was in, he always made that Sunday morning phone call. He called Eleanor every single Sunday. Not Arthur, but Eleanor. Once, when I was old enough to ask him about it directly, I did. He told me that Arthur was the one who gave him a way out, but Eleanor was the one who made him feel like he belonged there in the first place. He said that for a boy who grew up with neither a way out nor a place to belong, the difference between a handout and a home was a massive deal. I carried that lesson into adulthood, and it wasn't until I started building my own life that I truly understood what it meant. I started to see the line between 2 kinds of people. The ones who provide things for you, and the ones who make you feel like that provision isn't charity, but just the natural result of your own worth. So, when I dialed his number from my Seattle hotel room, I knew exactly what this call would mean to him. This wasn't a business matter or a legal dispute, it was a personal insult. I was calling to tell him that someone had walked into the house he built out of love and used my name as a weapon to force strangers inside. I was Arthur's daughter, calling him on the private line my family had always used. I knew he would answer. I also knew the immense restraint it would take for him to process it. That is the specific cost men like Julian absorb without a sound, because they decided a long time ago that the people they love shouldn't have to carry their anger. He wouldn't let me see his rage. He never had. That was just who he was. That was who he had always been. I pressed the dial button. The Seattle skyline stretched out wide beyond my window. The city lights, the late-night traffic, and that deep, quiet stillness unique to the Pacific Northwest after dark. It rang twice. My mother called me at 9:24 p.m. Marcus called at 9:47 p.m. 23 minutes. That was the exact window of time it took for a 68-year-old woman sitting in the intake room of a state assessment center to pull a slip of paper with an address out of her coat pocket and make a call after her husband dropped her off, drove away, and dialed my number. His voice had carried that specific calm of a man who believed he had already cruised through the hardest part. He had no idea she had already called me. That was the first thing he didn't know. But it wasn't the biggest. Eleanor had described the whole morning to me in a methodical, step-by-step way. She laid out every single detail that needed my attention. No shaking, no dramatic displays of grief, just facts lined up in perfect order. It was the composure of a woman who had decided before she even dialed that she was not going to dump her panic onto my plate. That morning, Marcus had shown up at the Cape House with a letter. It was printed on stationery using my header, my full name, my partner title at the Boston architecture firm, and my office address. The letter explained that due to a transition in property management, temporary arrangements had been made for the current resident. Transportation had been set up to take her to a transitional care facility equipped with a full medical staff. The matter would be sorted out quickly. Everything was under control. My name was signed at the very bottom. My mother read it twice. She recognized my name. She recognized my title. But what she didn't recognize, and she told me this with a precision that made my chest tighten, was my voice anywhere in those sentences. She said I would never write a letter like that. The wording was wrong, the structure was off. The whole tone of the letter was a man's idea of how a professional woman talks, not who I actually was. But she was 68. She was alone in that house, and the man standing in front of her was her daughter's husband, holding a medical proxy with her daughter's name on it, waiting with a heavy, pressuring kind of patience. She didn't agree to leave because she completely believed the letter. She was smarter than that. She left because she was Arthur's wife. And Arthur's wife was never going to make a scene in Julian's house over a man she had already seen right through and deemed unworthy. She wasn't going to give him that excuse. She wasn't going to give him a single piece of leverage he could use against her daughter. Later at the assessment center, the intake clerk reviewed the letter, asked a few routine health questions, and requested identification. My mother handed it over. Marcus stepped up as the authorized family representative, explaining that due to urgent plumbing repairs and a transition of assets at the home, temporary medical care arrangements had been approved. He framed the move as an agreed-upon short-term family decision, staying right by her side through the entire intake process while my mother answered the clerk's questions herself. The clerk had no immediate reason to think she was being conned. In front of her was an elderly woman who had come voluntarily, carrying valid identification. A printed letter with a family member's name on it, which was a forged medical proxy, and a man claiming to be the authorized representative for that family. The intake worker asked for the name of the authorizing family member. Marcus said, Evelyn Arthur Vance, her daughter. The clerk wrote it down on the intake form. My mother watched him say my name to a government employee. She watched the pen move across the paper. She didn't say a single word. She asked for a pen of her own, wrote down the full name and address of the care center on a scrap of paper, folded it up, and tucked it into her coat pocket. Then she sat down in the chair they pointed to and waited quietly. 20 minutes after the intake process was finished, she called me. Her voice never wavered once. She described the letter, the drive, the intake form, and that name spoken out loud for the official record. When she was completely done, she said, I didn't make a scene at Julian's house. I would never do that. I asked her if she was comfortable. She said the conditions were passable. Then she said, Fix it, sweetheart, clean this mess up. And she hung up. I sat in total silence for 90 seconds. Then I opened my laptop and typed 3 words into the email subject line. Cross the line. I left the body blank. I sent it to Sarah Lynn and closed the laptop. Sarah read that email at 4:18 a.m. Boston time. She was at her desk by 6 a.m. The room service tray sat completely untouched on the desk. The Seattle night stretched out past the floor-to-ceiling windows. The amber streetlights and the traffic formed long, quiet ribbons of light as the city settled into its late-night calm. My project contracts were laid out across the table, 18 months of structural negotiations that were supposed to end tomorrow morning with a final signing in a conference room just 4 blocks away. I dialed the number, 2 rings. Arthur's daughter. No name, no small talk, just that. It was his way of confirming who I was, spoken in that specific low tone of his. To him, that confirmation had always meant something way past emotion. It was a structural thing, carrying a sense of responsibility in the absolute best meaning of the word. I gave him the whole story, delivering it the exact way I always pass along critical information, methodical, in order, and completely free of my own commentary. The letter with my header. The forged signature at the bottom. My name being entered into the care center's intake forms by a government worker while I was stuck in a Seattle hotel room 4,000 miles away. Marcus's call, every single timestamp. When I finished, I just waited. The silence that followed lasted almost 10 full seconds. I know, because I counted the beats in my head. In over 30 years of knowing Julian Vance, I had never heard him stay quiet for that long. Not even when his Silicon Valley headquarters was facing an antitrust investigation that almost tore the company apart. Not even on that early morning when I called him from the hospital to tell him Arthur wasn't going to make it. Never. Julian was a man who always had his next sentence ready. It wasn't out of nervousness, but because he had spent decades making decisions in rooms where hesitation cost too much money, forcing his brain to operate with absolute clarity. 10 seconds, I just let that silence stretch out. Then he asked, "Where exactly is Aunt Eleanor right now?" I gave him the address of the care center, the time of intake, the name of the clerk Eleanor had noted down before folding that slip of paper into her coat pocket. This time the silence was shorter. "I'll handle the house. You focus on signing your contracts. Come home on your own schedule." He was in Palo Alto, where it was already late. I knew he had a massive board meeting the next morning that had been on the books for 6 weeks. Yet he said those 2 sentences without a single second of hesitation, entirely free of any dramatic display of sacrifice. It was the tone people use when the decision has already been made long before the words ever leave their mouth. I knew exactly what he was putting into motion. Vance Capital's Boston property manager had been handling the regular upkeep, seasonal maintenance, and contractor coordination for the Cape House for 6 years as part of their holding portfolio. Julian had full legal authority to act on the property through that representative without ever having to show his face. He didn't need to be in Boston to make Boston and Maine move. He never did. But past the logistics, I understood something else. It was something without a real name, but I had felt the shape of it my entire life. It was that specific weight that comes when someone acts entirely on your behalf, not out of obligation, but out of a bond that existed long before you were even old enough to remember it forming. He built that house for my parents because my father took him in when he had nowhere to go, and my mother made him feel like he belonged there. This was that exact same loyalty, stretching across decades, completely unchanged. I ordered room service. I went back over my contract documents. I flagged 3 clauses that needed attention in the morning and stacked them neatly on the desk. I set my alarm. I turned off the lamp. For the first time in 2 years, I fell asleep without any trouble at all. Back in Boston, a notice on Vance Frontier Capital stationery was being drawn up overnight. Official, precise, and completely unmistakable. It would arrive at the front gates of the Cape House in Maine before sunrise. I wasn't there for this next part. I patched it together the way you always piece together things that happened in rooms you weren't supposed to be in. I used the property manager's logs, the things Kevin, Marcus's brother, blabbed to people later on, and the specific tone Chloe, Kevin's wife, used over the next few weeks whenever she described the house to anyone who would listen. She was totally oblivious to the truth, completely unaware that she was describing something that had never belonged to her husband, herself, or her brother-in-law. Marcus had told them just enough to make the lie work, but not enough to make it safe. He told them the house belonged to my family, that the current living arrangements were being adjusted, that I was away on business in Seattle, and that the handoff was already taken care of. When he needed to be precise, he called it a temporary setup. When Chloe heard what she wanted to hear, he let her assume it was permanent. Kevin heard the parts that should have made him suspicious, but he chose not to look into it. That was his own call. He would have to live with the fallout. Chloe walked through the rooms of the Cape House the way a woman walks through a place she thinks is finally hers, slow, with a smug kind of purpose. She touched the iron garden gate when she walked in. She didn't push it open, she just touched it. It was the way people touch things when they are claiming ownership. She walked through the massive kitchen, critiquing the custom hardwood cabinets. She stood at the doorway of the antique library, looking at the bookshelves. Arthur had spent 50 years collecting those architecture originals and old books. They were lined up exactly the way a man keeps them when he plans on revisiting them at any moment. Picture frames were tucked neatly between the books. She remarked on what a beautiful room it was. She said it the way a woman says something is beautiful while already rearranging it completely in her head. She found the house incredibly comfortable, the way houses built with real intent always are. It had a quality you could feel before you could even name it. There was a groundedness to the rooms, a perfection to the proportions, and a sense that whoever designed the space was thinking about the people living in it, not showing it off for photos. Julian had built it so my parents could finally rest. Chloe settled into that intent, completely blind to whose intent it was or what it had cost. She settled in. That was the word for it. She settled into that house the way someone does when they believe a long wait is finally over, and the thing they patiently anticipated has finally been delivered. Kevin moved a bit differently. He was quieter than his wife, touching less and looking more, moving through the space with a tentative edge she didn't have. He knew more about how the arrangement had been made than Chloe did. He asked his brother fewer questions than he should have, and he accepted the answers with a lot less scrutiny than the situation called for. That was his choice, too. 他们在那栋房子里待了11个小时，然后信封送到了. It was delivered at exactly 6:14 a.m. A sealed envelope was slipped through the crack of the front door, showing a return address for Vance Frontier Capital Boston Property Division. Chloe found it when she came downstairs. She stood in the dim morning light of the hallway and opened it. She read it 3 times at normal speed, and then a 4th time, very slowly. It was the way a person reads a document hoping that a closer look might somehow change what it says. The meaning didn't change at all. The notice was incredibly precise and completely ruthless. The property was listed as private commercial real estate held by Vance Frontier Capital. The current occupants had no legal authorization to be there. They had 72 hours to clear out. Failure to comply would trigger immediate formal eviction proceedings. Printed at the bottom was the phone number for the holding company's legal representative in Boston. My name wasn't anywhere on it. Marcus's name wasn't on it either. There was no need to mention either of us. This notice wasn't dealing with a family dispute. It was dealing with trespassing. Chloe immediately called her husband, and then Kevin called Marcus. Marcus's phone rang 4 times before he picked up. By then, nothing he said even mattered. The notice was already in their hands. The 72-hour countdown had started. The issue was being handled the only way truly permanent things are settled. Quietly, through corporate channels, with absolutely no room for negotiation. That 3-word email hit Sarah Lynn's inbox at 4:18 a.m. She read it on her phone in the dark of her bedroom, sitting up straight before her feet even touched the floor. She had been expecting a message from Evelyn for 18 months. Not this specific message and not these exact 3 words, but any sign that the line between preparation and action had been crossed meant there was work to be done immediately. It couldn't wait for regular business hours. She was at her office by 6 a.m. The file had been ready for a long time. That was the thing about working with Evelyn. The prep work was always finished long before the situation demanded it. 11 days after that Sunday family dinner at the Cape House, where that man had asked about Julian Vance in that calculating way, Evelyn made a call, and Sarah built the file. Sarah listened to Evelyn describe that moment and knew exactly what kind of husband they were dealing with. That file held 14 months of detailed tracking, property records, the complete structure of the inheritance trusts, estate documents going back 2 generations, every single conversation Sarah had logged, every question Evelyn had asked, and every single safeguard put in place during that quiet window of time, before Marcus even realized he was being kept at arm's length. Now she added his losing move to the stack. Before 7 a.m., she had a brief call with Eleanor, who had already gotten the word from Evelyn and understood exactly why Sarah was calling. A signed authorization allowing the release of intake records and medical documentation was faxed over to the care center. Sarah demanded the intake logs. They arrived within the hour. It was a standard intake form, with the authorized family representative's name logged in the designated box. An intake clerk had reviewed the forged medical proxy handed to her and recorded the name she was given during the process. Evelyn Vance. Sarah cross-referenced the timestamp on that intake form with Evelyn's travel logs, the Seattle hotel registry, the keycard access logs, and the flight information proved clear as day that Evelyn had already been in Washington state 3 days before that form was signed. There was absolutely no overlap in the timestamps, nothing that could be explained away as a coincidence or a miscommunication. When Evelyn's name was being written on that form, she was physically in Seattle. She hadn't given authorization, she hadn't called, she hadn't sent a representative. Her name had been spoken out loud into an official intake record by another person, without her knowledge or consent. This opened up serious issues that went way past a divorce dispute. And because the document was an official medical care intake record involving a state facility, rather than private correspondence, Sarah saw a clear risk of criminal fraud exposure that existed completely independent of any divorce proceedings. 2 tracks were running at the same time, and she had enough evidence to start moving trains down both of them. She had the complaint ready within 36 hours of walking into her office. She communicated with Evelyn in Seattle the way they always did, with extreme precision, entirely free of any extra fluff. Both women understood that in tough moments, clarity itself is a form of care. Sarah's understanding of Marcus's move, and the key point she made sure echoed through every single document she filed, was simple. This wasn't done in a fit of anger. Anger creates impulsive, inconsistent, self-defeating behavior that can be hard to document because it lacks a coherent logical structure. What Marcus did was structured. The letter with Evelyn's header, the rehearsed interaction with the intake clerk, the deliberate use of a name he had absolutely no right to touch. That wasn't an impulse, that was intent. Intent was absolutely everything. It was the sharp line that separated a messy family dispute from a case serious enough to draw a criminal investigation, and Sarah built her entire legal strategy around that exact difference. The text she sent me arrived in Seattle at 7:52 a.m. "He used your name on an official intake form. This isn't just a divorce case anymore." I read it, placed my phone face down on the table, and picked up my contract documents. Then I headed out to the conference room. Back in Boston, Marcus had been dialing numbers nonstop since the sun came up. He hadn't realized yet that every single unanswered call was a door that had been permanently shut. Not by accident, not temporarily, but closed forever. The conference room in Seattle featured panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, and the people sitting around the table had flown in from London, Singapore, Zurich, and New York. 18 months of intense structural negotiations were finalized in a single morning, around a table that cost more than some people's first homes. In reality, the price of that table didn't matter nearly as much as the massive project that had brought everyone there in the first place. I sat in my seat, which was exactly where I belonged. Not because the room was jaw-dropping. I had stopped being intimidated by so-called big rooms back in my 40s, when I finally realized that the people who built them were rarely more capable than the people they were trying to scare. I sat there because I had earned my place at that table through 18 months of preparation, relentless competence, and the kind of quiet professional stability that never needs to shout for attention. Arthur used to say that a person who has truly reached the top never has to announce their arrival to the room. The room just knows. I signed exactly where I was supposed to sign. I answered every question thrown my way. When the sharp questions came up, the ones that required a lot more than a signature, testing whether you actually understood the massive urban development project you spent 18 months building, I answered them with the perfect precision of someone who had laid the groundwork herself, rather than just supervising from a distance. When the meeting wrapped up, the room filled with that specific atmosphere that only comes after finishing something truly difficult. It wasn't exactly a celebration. It was more like the collective exhale of people who had been carrying a massive weight for a very long time and had finally set it down safely. People shook hands and confirmed commitments. Professionals exchanged those polite, respectful words that mean you have tested each other through a long negotiation and come out with mutual respect. The deal increased my financial independence in a massive way. Not because I needed the money. The trusts had ensured my absolute security long before I ever married anyone. It mattered because I built it with my own hands. My standing in the industry, my network, and my professional capability had been maintained through 15 years of hard work in rooms that weren't always eager to welcome me in. Arthur laid the foundation, but every single floor above it was built with my own hands. My own judgment and the grit to stay at the table when walking away would have been the easy choice. It meant the world to me, and I didn't need to explain that meaning to anyone in that conference room or anywhere else. Afterward, I went out for a nice dinner. I ordered something truly worth savoring, picking a dish from a section of the menu I normally didn't explore. The wine recommended by the sommelier turned out even better than I expected. I enjoyed easy-flowing conversation with people who had spent days measuring my professional worth, and finally arrived at a conclusion I was incredibly happy with. I was completely present. I was warm. I wasn't distracted for a single second by anything happening 4,000 miles away in Maine or Boston. I called my mother from the restaurant. She asked how dinner was, and I described the food, the dishes, the wine, and the specific vibe of the place. She listened, then offered her thoughts on European cooking, which she had been perfecting ever since her trip to Italy with Arthur back in 1987. She delivered her opinions with the absolute confidence of a woman who had spent 37 years refining her tastes and saw no reason to compromise. We talked for 22 minutes, never once mentioning Marcus, the eviction notice, the fraud lawsuit, or any of that garbage. It was just the two of us, doing what we had always done, talking about food, travel, and those tiny, precise observations my mother made about the world. I had been collecting those observations my entire life, though I never told her I was doing it. Once dinner was over, I booked my flight back for 3 days later, much later than Marcus expected, entirely on my own schedule. Just like Julian told me, I was going home at my own pace. I slept beautifully that night. In Boston, I was absolutely certain someone else wasn't sleeping at all. He called the next day. I picked up. Not because I owed him a conversation, but because I wanted him to hear what I sounded like when everything he had spent 2 years carefully plotting had completely turned to ash. I wanted him to have that exact experience. hearing my calm, unhurried voice on the other end of a phone call he had been terrified to make. He had spent 72 hours watching his plan fall apart in a sequence he couldn't interrupt or cover up. His brother and sister-in-law had been booted off the property by an eviction notice from a company he hadn't even heard of. Right after getting that panicked call from Kevin, he contacted his lawyer. His lawyer looked into the Cape House address and came back with fatal news. None of the contingency plans Marcus had built were going to work. The property had nothing to do with my inheritance, nothing to do with my name, and couldn't be touched by a divorce lawsuit or any marital asset claims. It was private commercial property held by a private holding company. His lawyer told him flat out that there was no viable path to claim any interest in it using the strategy he had built. Then the lawsuit landed. His name was tied directly to an official medical intake document. A timestamp and a verified location log proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was physically in Seattle when my name was written on that form. A lawyer named Sarah Lynn had clearly been building a defensive record against him for a hell of a lot longer than he had been plotting against me. Men like Marcus don't usually accept reality right away. He went out for a second opinion, then a third. He used a connection in Boston commercial real estate to get in touch with another old-school attorney and paid a massive fee for an expedited review of the property records. The answer came back in different words, but the bottom line was exactly the same. The Cape House wasn't mine. It had never been mine. Whatever strategy he thought he had built around it had absolutely nowhere to land. When he called, he fully expected to run into the version of Evelyn he thought he married. The woman he believed he could pressure back into a corner that favored him. He had his version of the conversation all ready to go. He had the excuses, the explanations, and a way to reframe the narrative to paint his actions as coming from a place of care rather than cold calculation. He had practiced the exact tone he would use. Measured, reasonable, the voice of a man just trying to find a solution to a situation that had spun out of control. I let him lay it all out there, every single rehearsed sentence. I didn't interrupt him once. I didn't change my breathing, and I didn't make those tiny noises people make when they are reacting to what they are hearing. I just held the phone and let him finish. When he finally ran out of words, I said, "Marcus, you packed your brother's family into a house that never belonged to me, and that I had absolutely no right to give you. Think long and hard about what that actually means." Then I hung up. What did it mean? It was something I knew he would be digesting slowly through most of the coming days and nights. Every single calculation he had meticulously plotted over 2 years was built on a premise that never existed. The Cape House wasn't mine. It had never been mine. It wasn't part of my inheritance, it wasn't listed on my estate documents, and it couldn't be touched by any legal paperwork tied to our marriage. He had locked onto it as his main target, and built his entire strategy around acquiring something that was completely unavailable to him. Not hard to get, completely unavailable. The whole architecture of his plan was sitting on a foundation that wasn't even there. He called his lawyer again. His lawyer had nothing new to tell him. He called 2 people in the Boston real estate world who knew property law inside and out. Nobody could offer a single piece of useful advice. He tried to spin a story around the letter, claiming I had given verbal authorization for the move, that the written forms were just a clerical error, a miscommunication that could be straightened out easily if I would just cooperate. His lawyer cut him off. That argument required my cooperation to survive even an hour of cross-examination. His lawyer asked him directly if he honestly thought that cooperation was coming. Marcus didn't say a word. The silence on the line was the answer itself, and they both knew it. Later that evening, a formal legal notice was sent out from Sarah's office. It was ironclad and completely precise. The fraud case involving the forged medical documents would be handled entirely separate from the divorce proceedings. 2 completely independent tracks, both moving at full speed. When he made that reckless move, he thought he only had one problem to solve. Now, entirely by his own doing, he had knotted himself into a dozen fatal corners. Sarah told me about that meeting later on. Not every single detail. Sarah never gave me more information than I actually needed, but enough. She described it the way she describes all tough professional standoffs, extremely precise, entirely free of personal emotion, and with the careful economy of words unique to a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms where words carry legal consequences. The conference room was high up in a tower in the Boston Seaport district. Marcus's lawyer arrived carrying a yellow legal pad and an air of cautious restraint. His client had told him there was still some defensible position to be found in this mess, and he hadn't yet verified if that was actually true. Sarah had him sit down. Then she opened her folder and started breaking down the inheritance line by line. Over several decades, Arthur's estate had grown to more than $12 million in assets, all heavily protected. The money was locked inside an irrevocable discretionary trust with a strict spendthrift clause. Sarah explained every single piece of it to his attorney, treating it like a standard legal lesson, making sure there was absolutely no room for confusion or future excuses. Irrevocable. That trust had been meticulously designed by Arthur's estate lawyers 20 years before I ever got married. Its entire purpose was to withstand any kind of legal or financial pressure. It could not be changed, dissolved, or renegotiated. Creditors couldn't touch it, I couldn't touch it, and Marcus certainly couldn't claim a single dime of it. Being irrevocable wasn't just a feature, it was the whole point. Arthur had seen too many fortunes get negotiated away during his years with the unions, and he made damn sure his wealth would never face that fate. Discretionary meant the money was controlled entirely by independent trustees, not by me. I couldn't just tell them to release funds because someone demanded it, which meant a divorcing spouse couldn't force me to exercise a power I didn't even have. The control stayed firmly with the trustees. Their only job was to protect and distribute those assets for my long-term benefit, using their own independent judgment. As far as Marcus's claims went, there was zero legal leverage to force a distribution they didn't want to make. Then came the spendthrift clause. Sarah explained that under the trust's structure and the facts of this case, Marcus had absolutely no way to attach, garnish, or touch a single asset held inside it. These clauses were drafted specifically to isolate assets in the event of a messy divorce, backed up by the entire design of the trust. This wasn't some rare legal trick. In fact, it was the exact reason wealthy families used these structures in the first place. Sarah said Marcus's lawyer stopped taking notes halfway through her explanation of the second part. By the time she finished the third, he put his pen down completely. There was no clever loophole for Marcus to exploit. It wasn't a matter of the strategy being too complicated. It simply didn't exist. Marcus had spent 2 whole years locking onto a target, building a strategy, and executing a plan against a structure he had absolutely zero chance of touching during our marriage. He never even got close to the core. He hadn't even scratched the surface. The structure he was trying to break into didn't have a door he could exploit, and it hadn't for 20 years. It was built specifically to keep out predators exactly like him. Sarah packed up her files with the smooth, unhurried efficiency of a woman whose work in that room was completely finished. She looked across the table at Marcus's lawyer and said that as for the medical document fraud, that was entirely separate, and he was going to have to face that on his own. She left him with those words. Down in the office building's parking garage, Marcus's lawyer sat in his car and made a 4-minute phone call to his client. Sarah told me this detail much later, but she said for most of those 4 minutes, Marcus didn't say a single word. He just listened. He listened the way a man does when he is finally told that the door he thought was wide open had actually been a solid concrete wall the entire time. Sarah mentioned it casually, like a piece of business that had already been wrapped up, slipping it into the middle of a longer update. It was a detail she almost forgot to mention because it was taken care of before my plane even landed. 2 days before I flew back to Boston, Julian had walked into Sarah's office. He hadn't told me he was coming, and he hadn't called Sarah ahead of time. He just showed up, sat across from her for 14 minutes, reviewed the filings and the ongoing lawsuits, asked 2 questions, and left. Sarah said he was the calmest person she had seen through this entire ordeal, a compliment coming from one stone-cold professional to another. Julian didn't go straight to the house in Maine. He went to the assessment center first. He sat with my mother for 2 hours in a bleak visitation room with harsh fluorescent lights and chairs built for utility rather than comfort. He didn't bring up the house. He didn't mention Marcus, the eviction notices, the fraud charges, or any of the legal machinery that had been set in motion. Instead, he asked about her garden, what she was planting along the south wall this spring, and her plans for the autumn flower beds. He asked what she was reading. When she told him, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a book, an antique clock restoration guide she had casually mentioned wanting during a Sunday call 3 months back. He laid it on the table between them without any explanation. It was just like all the other gifts he had quietly carried around for months, entirely free of drama or a big show of generosity, as if anticipating people's needs and meeting them was simply the most natural thing in the world. My mother thanked him the only way she knew how. There were no dramatic gestures, no over-the-top words of gratitude that would make them both uncomfortable. She just said thank you and placed the book on her lap. That was more than enough for both of them. Only then did he go to see his house. The property manager met him at the Cape House with the full logs. Within 72 hours, the eviction notice had been fully executed. Kevin and Chloe were gone. The house looked exactly the way it did when he originally handed it over to my parents. The antique library was completely untouched. Arthur's books were lined up perfectly, and the photos on the shelves hadn't been moved. Eleanor's garden along the south wall looked just as it did when she left. Nothing had been taken, and nothing had been rearranged into something it shouldn't be. Julian walked through the rooms without making a single comment. The property manager told me later that he moved through the space like a man who had built the structure himself. He wasn't inspecting it, he was just confirming it, making sure it was still itself. Before he left the property, he arranged for my mother's return. There were no dramatic orders. He just told the manager to coordinate the logistics, and the manager took care of it. The very next morning, Eleanor came back to the Cape House with everything she had taken to the assessment center. She walked through the front door just like she always did, without any fuss or ceremony, carrying the quiet composure of a woman returning to a place that had always belonged to her. She touched the door as she walked in, letting her hand rest on the latch for just a second. Then she went inside. By the time my plane landed, Julian was already back in Silicon Valley. He had spent 3 days on the East Coast and hadn't spoken to a single soul besides Sarah, my mother, and his property manager. There were no public statements, no appearances, and absolutely nothing that could be called a performance. He called Eleanor right before boarding his flight, and they talked for 40 minutes. When Sarah told me all of this, I sat quietly and absorbed it for a long time. I replayed it in my mind, trying to find the exact words to capture what it all meant, but I couldn't find them. Eventually, I realized that words were simply too light to carry that kind of weight, so I stopped looking. Boston never announces its verdicts out loud. That isn't how the city works. There are no public statements, no formal firings, and nobody stands up in a crowded room to announce a decision. The city is far too respectable for anything that blunt. Instead, what happens is much quieter and infinitely more permanent. Doors slide shut, rooms fill up, and the person who had been waiting for an invitation suddenly finds themselves locked on the outside, without a single soul explaining why. There is never an explanation. Marcus had spent 4 years of our marriage trying to climb to a specific tier in Boston society. Not the tier he was currently in. He had a moderate amount of success in investment banking, but compared to the families he was clinging to, that success always looked tiny. He wanted into the elite networks of Beacon Hill. He wanted a piece of those high-level financial circles and old money networks where paths cross at a completely different altitude. In Boston, the connection between your professional standing and your social access is incredibly real and deeply powerful. It all comes down to who vouches for you and what your name actually means when it gets brought up in the right rooms. He had been moving steadily toward that goal. He truly believed our marriage, along with the inheritance he assumed I would eventually unlock, was the exact tool that would bridge that final gap. He was patient about it, the way he was patient about most things he wanted. He was quiet, deliberate, carrying the discipline of a man who thought he had figured out the chessboard and was playing a long game. Except, what was actually circulating quietly through those elite Boston circles was a very specific set of facts. Word got out that a man had forged his wife's name on a government medical care document while she was 4,000 miles away in Seattle, signing a major urban planning contract. That wife happened to be Arthur's daughter, and the name Arthur carries a very specific indelible weight in certain Boston rooms. It wasn't the kind of weight built on flashiness or big talk. It was the kind accumulated over decades of quiet, unshakable integrity that people naturally remembered without ever needing to be reminded. On top of that, the property this man had tried to seize as leverage turned out to belong entirely to Vance Frontier Capital. And Julian Vance's name carries a completely different, but equally unshakable kind of power in those exact same circles. The fraud lawsuit was public record. The trespassing eviction notice was public record. Anyone who knew Julian understood exactly what those documents meant. Someone had entered his property uninvited and filled it with strangers. It wasn't just an abstract legal issue. It was an absolute statement of character. It was an announcement of exactly who a person is when they think nobody important is watching. Anyone who knew my family also understood exactly what it meant for my name to be written on a government medical document by a man who had absolutely no right to touch it. Neither of those things needed to be explained. They were the explanation. Nobody ever confronted Marcus face to face. He wasn't called out at a cocktail party, he wasn't formally expelled from any professional societies, and none of the people who owed him a candid, uncomfortable conversation ever brought it up to his face. That simply isn't the Boston way. What happened was a hell of a lot quieter, and because of that, it hit infinitely harder. The phone call he had been waiting for from a major financial player never came. The introductions that had been informally promised to him at a party 2 months earlier simply faded away. A high-end invitation to an elite event down in the Seaport district, one that was right on the verge of being sent to him, was quietly pulled without a word of explanation. People who used to reply to his texts within an hour suddenly took 2 days to get back to him, before they stopped responding altogether. A massive high-net-worth asset management project that he had poured nearly 8 months of his life into was suddenly handed over to a rival firm. That project was absolutely crucial to his career. He had sunk months of meetings, proposal revisions, consulting fees, and relationship building into it. He had spoken about it so confidently to everyone around him that people had already assumed the deal was completely in the bag. The official line was that there was no reason. The official line was that it was strictly a business decision. But deep down, Marcus knew the exact timing of everything that had just happened, and he could no longer lie to himself and call it a coincidence. The rooms he had spent 4 years trying to squeeze into had quietly reshuffled their decks. There was no confrontation, no explanation, and no single turning point he could point to and blame for changing everything. There was only a creeping, irreversible realization that the doors he had spent years hammering on were completely gone. He called me one more time. I saw his name light up the screen. I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and just kept driving. I was already back on the East Coast. I didn't go to my place in Boston first. I drove straight to my mother's. It was never a choice I had to consciously make. It was just where I naturally went the second I landed. It's like water finding its way back to where it belongs, not out of obligation, but because Eleanor was the coordinates I set for myself whenever the world started to tilt and I needed to find my footing again. She had always been that for me. She always would be. The Cape House looked exactly the way it did when I left. The garden along the south wall was in full midsummer bloom. She had planted early that year, long before any of this mess started, and by late June, the flower beds were thick and bursting with life. We sat outside in the late afternoon heat, sipping cold drinks. There was that specific kind of quiet between us, the kind you only get with someone when you never have to rehearse what you want to say, and the words just come out naturally. She didn't ask about Sarah's filings. She didn't ask about Marcus's lawyers, the timeline for the fraud case, or any of the legal machinery that had been grinding away while I was gone. Instead, she asked about Seattle. She asked about the project, who was sitting across the table from me, how those final hours of negotiations played out, and what the city felt like in the evening after the work was finally done. She listened to the details of my career the way she always had, with absolute focus, entirely free of cheap compliments, carrying a deep, unshakable pride she never needed to say out loud. We stayed out in the garden until the afternoon light turned to twilight and the temperature dipped just enough for us to notice. Then, I drove over to the Boston townhouse I had shared with Marcus. I timed it perfectly. I knew his schedule inside and out, and I knew exactly when the house would be empty. I didn't want a scene. It wasn't because I was afraid of a confrontation, but because I simply had nothing left to say to his face. Everything we needed to communicate had already been handled through channels that didn't require me to raise my voice. I moved through the rooms with total efficiency, the final logistical steps of a woman who had spent 2 years quietly detaching herself emotionally. I took my design portfolios and blueprints from the study. I took my grandmother's silver from the dining room cabinet. It was an asset I brought into the marriage under my own name, and he had always known better than to touch it. I took the drafting tools and old photographs Arthur had left me. I had hung them in the hallway because I wanted them close by, and now I was taking them somewhere else. There were a handful of other things, items that were purely mine, because no matter what a shared address implies, some things only ever belong to one person. I didn't search the house for proof of what he had turned into while I was getting ready to leave. That page had already been turned. Whatever he was doing to himself inside those walls was no longer information I needed to know. I walked through each room exactly once. I didn't look back. I left my keys on the kitchen island. It wasn't a statement, and the gesture carried absolutely no extra weight beyond its practical meaning. I just set them down and walked out the door. I had walked through that door hundreds of times over a 4-year marriage. But that marriage had ended on a meaningful level the exact night I sat at the Cape House dinner table, watched him recalculating behind his eyes, and made a decision I would never announce to anyone. Before I pulled out of the driveway, I called Sarah. "I'm entirely done at the house," she said. "Then we move forward on all fronts." I drove away without looking back at the house in the rearview mirror. There was nothing back there worth looking at. Everything had been settled. The trust was entirely intact. It had never been in danger, not for a single day of my marriage. But there was a specific kind of satisfaction in knowing it was secure after someone had spent 2 years trying to tear it apart. It felt different. It wasn't exactly relief. It was more like the quiet contentment of watching a structure you built, or that your family built for you, hold up perfectly under the exact weight it was designed to carry, without shifting a fraction of an inch. The Cape House was back to normal. My mother was back in her garden. The fraud case was moving through the legal system under Sarah's tight grip, which meant it would proceed with the exact precision that a brutal legal scrutiny requires, but rarely actually gets. The divorce papers were served. The marriage was over on every single level that mattered. I took it all in, settling into the deep quiet that comes after you finally finish something you've been carrying on your back for a very long time. There was no celebration. There was no dramatic sigh of relief at the end of a movie. Just quiet. It was the quiet of a woman who had planned meticulously, waited patiently, and then watched every single piece land exactly where she knew it would. I thought about Arthur. Not the version of him I put together for his eulogy, and not the one I described whenever people asked about my father in social settings. I thought about the private version of him. The man sitting by that old sawdust-covered table with a 16-year-old boy, an architectural blueprint, and a specific kind of patience. He knew he wasn't just teaching structural mechanics. He was teaching a boy how to look at the world, how to evaluate a situation and see what was actually there, rather than what he hoped was there. That skill, applied with 50 years of absolute integrity, had built every single thing that actually mattered in this story. It wasn't my inheritance, and it wasn't the house. It was the bonds and relationships that existed in the rooms Marcus had never even thought to look into. I thought about Julian, sitting in that bleak visitation room with the harsh fluorescent lights and utility chairs, asking my mother what she was planting along the south wall. A man running a massive private capital firm across 4 countries, who had a major board meeting the morning after I called him, quietly flying halfway across the country to Boston, going to a state care facility before he even set foot on his own property. Because that was the order Arthur would have chosen, and Julian had spent 50 years using that exact compass to steer his life. That was the one thing Marcus's 2 years of research had completely missed. He was diligent. I want to be entirely accurate about that, because accuracy matters a hell of a lot more than the cheap comfort of putting him down. He mapped out the inheritance. He locked onto the trust. He found the Cape House in Maine and built a strategy around it that looked organized, patient, and fairly complex on the surface. He did the work a man does when he is absolutely determined to steal something. But he never once looked past the surface of what I owned to ask what I actually meant to the people standing right behind me. He never looked past the name itself to study Julian Vance. He never asked what that bond was built on, how old it was, or how it would react the second someone tried to put pressure on it. He never considered that the house he had locked onto as his main target had a history that started long before I was even born, carried by a legal structure that had nothing to do with my inheritance, my name, or anything that could be touched through our marriage. He studied the inventory of my life with extreme care, yet he never once thought to study its architecture. He came for what I had. He never thought to ask how deeply I was loved by the people who actually mattered. He never understood that those were 2 completely different questions, and only the second one could tell him exactly what kind of abyss he was stepping into. That was his true miscalculation. It wasn't the forged letter, the intake forms at the care center, the illegal eviction notices, or the impending fraud charges and unbreakable trust clauses. Those were just the consequences. The real mistake happened much earlier, it was much simpler, and it was entirely his own fault. He studied everything I owned. He never once thought to look at who I was, or the kind of people who loved me. This was always going to be his ending. The woman sitting across from my husband was incredibly cautious. That was the very first detail I noticed. She wasn't flashy or loud in her beauty, but she carried an immense amount of composure, the kind of stillness that only comes from years of deliberate practice. As she held her custom bone china coffee cup, her fingers rested tightly against the bottom edge of the handle, and she never looked at me for a single second longer than basic politeness required. Her name was Elena Rostova. Julian introduced her as an M&A crisis management specialist out of Chicago. He said it with his usual smooth tone, carrying just the right amount of warmth to make this glass conference room in downtown Austin feel completely safe. But I wasn't safe. I hadn't been safe for weeks. My name is Eleanor. I'm a professor of systems architecture and data security at a top university in Texas. For 20 years, I've spent my life studying how complex systems operate, looking at the exact ways people leave digital footprints and logical vulnerabilities in networks they are desperately trying to hide. My entire career is built on a single realization. The way a system looks on the surface and the actual code running underneath are often two completely different things. Julian knew my research involved networks and data. He just assumed I was stuck in an ivory tower, analyzing everything theoretically from the outside. It never once crossed his mind that for a woman like me, seeing through disguises and finding vulnerabilities isn't an academic exercise. It's the exact room I live in every single day. He had been making that exact mistake for 12 straight years. And on that morning, he made it for the very last time. If you're watching this footage from anywhere in the world, leave your city in the comments. I want to see exactly where this story lands. That meeting was a setup, carefully orchestrated by Julian to put his control on full display. The high-floor views, the heavily air-conditioned room, the long walnut table. Before I even arrived, he had already ordered all the documents and coffee to be waiting. That was his signature move, wrapping his need for control in a blanket of thoughtfulness. He was completely relaxed, carrying the posture of a man who truly believed he had already won the game. Elena, on the other hand, sat there like a precise piece of machinery. I kept my mouth shut. The meeting moved forward with the natural rhythm of these corporate standoffs, packed with airtight business talk and cautious smiles, until Julian leaned in slightly toward Elena and completely switched languages. It started 4 weeks ago with a dream that felt like a strange piece of fiction, but I still forced myself to read every single word of it. Julian and Elena were speaking Russian. Their tone was casual, unhurried. It was the safe, calculated register a man only uses when he is absolutely certain there isn't a third person in the room who can understand a single word. He was telling her in Russian that the dose of the optic nerve inhibitor had finally reached its critical threshold. He said the legal evaluation for cognitive decline was scheduled within the next 48 hours. Once his medical power of attorney kicked in, all of my intellectual property, a massive top-tier encrypted patent library he referred to as the Aegis Protocol, a system valued at hundreds of millions of dollars on the open market, would officially transfer to his venture capital fund. He used the word divestment. Elena responded in a tight, restrained tone, the voice of someone closing a deal rather than making small talk. My phone was lying face down, flat against my leather planner. It had been recording since the exact second he switched languages. 4 weeks ago, I was standing in my own hallway and overheard an encrypted VoIP call that told me to stay ready. Ever since that moment, I had been. With a hand that didn't shake at all, I poured myself a glass of ice water. I sat there listening to my husband calmly plot my legal and biological erasure in Russian. And as a woman who has spent half her life decoding hidden messages, I understood every syllable. When he finished speaking, I set the water glass down. I looked straight at Elena, ignoring Julian entirely, and spoke in flawless, unaccented Moscow Russian. I said, "There is a very fine line between composure and stupidity. She really should have learned that before putting her signature on fraudulent asset transfers." 3 seconds. That was exactly how long Elena Rostova's composure lasted before something shattered deep behind her eyes. Beside her, Julian went completely rigid. It was the kind of dead silence that only happens to a man who realizes his entire foundation was wiped out by a single sentence. I picked up my tote bag. I stood up, taking my time. I walked right out of that glass conference room without looking back at them even once. Out in the main office, the partners didn't notice a thing. All they saw was a well-dressed, perfectly dignified woman calmly making her exit. I sat in my car in the underground parking garage for 30 seconds. Then I made 3 phone calls. To Victoria, my litigation attorney, to my independent toxicologist, and to Marcus, my federal patent agent. Before I could even finish dialing the last number, Julian's name lit up my screen. I watched it flash and didn't say a word. For 4 weeks, I had been piecing this conspiracy together bit by bit. At that conference table, Julian handed me the one piece of the puzzle he never intended for me to find. I wasn't surprised. Sitting at that table just gave me final confirmation. There is a massive difference between suspicion and certainty, and that difference changes everything. Surprise is for women who don't stay vigilant, and I had been hypervigilant for 4 straight weeks. It all began that evening I came home early from an academic symposium. Standing in the hallway just outside Julian's study, I heard my husband talking on the phone in Russian to someone he had never once mentioned to me. He didn't hear me walk in. The study door was cracked open, and he was deeply immersed in a conversation that had absolutely nothing to do with his usual venture capital projects. I stood there in total silence, listening. I didn't catch every single word, but I heard more than enough. Cognitive severing, neurotargeting, incremental doses, and then the takeover window. Those aren't words a tech VC uses in daily conversation. They don't belong in corporate merger negotiations, and they certainly didn't apply to any business Julian claimed to manage. Those are words from psychopharmacology and dark web trafficking. They came out of my husband's mouth completely naturally, with the fluency of a man who had been chewing on these concepts for a very long time. Then he laughed. That was the part that stayed with me the longest. Not the vocabulary, but the laugh. It was relaxed, completely unguarded. The laugh of a man who believed he was entirely safe. I hadn't heard Julian laugh like that in years. Standing there in the hallway before I could even fully process what was happening, I knew one thing for sure. I was hearing something I was never supposed to hear. I didn't walk into the study. I walked over to the kitchen island, quietly set my bag down, and turned on the espresso machine. 20 minutes later, when Julian walked out, I was sitting at the counter looking at my tablet. He kissed my cheek and asked how the symposium went. I told him it was great. I smiled. I had already decided that I wouldn't say a single word until I figured out exactly what kind of systemic threat I was dealing with. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a new file on my offline encrypted computer. I typed in the date, the time, and every single Russian word I had overheard. The medical terms, the dosages he mentioned, the laugh, and his timeline. That document became the very first page of a hidden archive. Over the next few weeks, that archive kept growing. I need to explain my background first, because it explains everything that happened next. My academic focus is in cybersecurity defense and root logic analysis. I've spent 20 years studying how people use code and language to hide their real intentions. During my PhD at MIT, I spent 3 years on a deep collaborative project with top Eastern European hackers and cryptographers. My fluency in Russian was forged in those server-packed underground labs and international cyber warfare simulations long before I ever met Julian. I never spoke Russian at home. It was a work language, not a domestic one. Julian knew I was fluent in several programming languages, and he knew I understood a few foreign languages, but he assumed it was just a reading-level understanding. It never crossed his mind that for a woman like me, fluency isn't just a skill, it's a hidden space I can retreat into at any moment. He made an assumption. He never bothered to test it. In 12 years, he hadn't thought to ask about it even once. The weeks following that phone call taught me even more. I started noticing details I had completely missed before because I trusted him too much. Julian's phone never left his hand. There were sudden trips to Silicon Valley that didn't match our shared calendar. Most telling of all, every single night, without fail, he would personally bring me my prescription eye drops for my early-stage macular degeneration. He would stand right there and watch me use them, staring with an intensity I had once mistaken for affection. It wasn't affection at all, it was surveillance. When a woman spends her entire career analyzing the gap between surface data and hidden backdoors, she doesn't ignore that gap when it appears in her own home. By the end of the third week, I saw the picture clearly. This wasn't a marriage crisis. This wasn't midlife boredom. This was a highly coordinated operation, and I was the target node. That realization didn't break me. It made me incredibly focused. That very same night, I picked up my bottle of eye drops. I held it up right under the desk lamp. I noticed something was off. There was nothing obviously wrong with the liquid, none of the blatant mistakes that scream poison. It was the kind of anomaly that only shows up if you are actively looking for it. The viscosity of the liquid was infinitesimally different. The surface tension of the drop at the tip of the bottle was a fraction of a millimeter off from the prescription I had been using for a year. The color was close, but close is not exact. My entire career has been spent teaching students that the tiny distance between exact and close is precisely where the truth hides. I stood under that lamp for a long time. Then I tightened the cap and put the bottle back exactly where it belonged on the nightstand, down to the millimeter. Same angle, same distance from the edge. I turned off the light, got into bed, and lay in the dark next to my husband without saying a word. The next morning, I waited for Julian to leave for his office in the financial district before making 2 phone calls. The first was to my ophthalmologist. I phrased my questions very carefully, making sure never to mention Julian, and leaving absolutely no electronic medical trail I couldn't control. I simply said I had doubts about the efficacy of this specific batch and requested a new prescription. I didn't use standard communication networks for the second call at all. I drove across the city to a private mass spectrometry lab in North Austin and knocked on the office door of a former student. Her current research focus is neurotoxin residue analysis. I told her I was working on an academic simulation regarding chemical interventions in corporate espionage and asked if she could analyze a sample for me. I handed her a sealed centrifuge tube. She agreed. I paid out of pocket for the real prescription eye drops at an independent pharmacy on the outskirts of Austin. I deliberately avoided using our shared medical insurance. Julian had access to those statements. Until everything was ready, I wasn't going to let an early refill trigger any alarms. 3 days later, my student called me into her lab and locked the door. The liquid was substituted. That was the first thing she told me. Her second point was that the sample contained high concentrations of a synthetic nerve inhibitor. She spoke with academic caution, keeping her conclusions reserved. She explained it was just a preliminary chemical analysis that wouldn't hold up as forensic evidence in court, but she was certain that long-term absorption of this compound through the mucous membranes would cause severe brain fog, memory gaps, and spatial disorientation, perfectly mimicking the symptoms of early-onset Alzheimer's. She told me that if this bottle belonged to a member of her family, she would call the police immediately. That was all I needed. I thanked her, went back to my office, closed the door, and sat in absolute silence for exactly 4 minutes. I allowed myself those 4 minutes to feel the full weight of the truth I had just confirmed. It wasn't that I held all the cards, it was that I finally held enough of them. Enough to stop using anything Julian handed me. Enough to start running a counter-investigation. Enough to understand that the man I had shared a bed with for 12 years was trying to chemically destroy my mind to steal my life's work. Then I stood up. I had work to do. I started using the real eye drops every morning at my office. At home, I meticulously maintained the level of the tainted bottle, discarding the exact amount each day so the volume decreased at a completely normal rate. Everything on the nightstand looked flawless. He had absolutely no reason to think the system had deviated. He was completely wrong about that, just like he was completely wrong about the Russian. I pulled up my encrypted health logs from the past 8 weeks. The memory lapses I had blamed on exhaustion. The mornings that felt like wading through deep mud. The cognitive sluggishness I thought was just aging. For the first time, I stopped attributing them to normal physiological decline. My body had been keeping score of an attempted murder. I just hadn't known how to read it until now. That night, Julian came over to the bed, kissed my forehead, and reminded me to take my drops. I smiled and told him I had already taken care of it. The single most dangerous move I could make was altering my routine. So I didn't. I understood that with absolute clarity. The morning after I confirmed the eye drops were poisoned, I knew Julian wasn't expecting to see a smart woman who had caught on. He was looking for a broken woman who was rapidly deteriorating. Those are 2 completely different performances. I've spent 20 years studying how people disguise themselves online and in real life, what they project, what they hide, and exactly how the seams begin to show when the facade fails. I was never going to let him see the seams. I was going to feed his system the exact data it expected to see, right up until the second I didn't need him to believe it anymore. My movements in the morning became just a bit slower. It wasn't a dramatic theatrical display, but rather a heavy, progressive sluggishness, like a body carrying too much weight. I dialed back my vocabulary at dinner. I let blank stares linger just a second too long during our conversations, though I never forced a tremor into my voice. A person who is actually losing their cognitive function doesn't perform. They just slip away. That's what I gave him. A steady, consistent decline. The quiet desperation of a woman who didn't even realize she was losing the war. Julian watched. That's the only word for it. He watched me the way a venture capitalist tracks a stock they are preparing to short. There was no worry in his eyes, only calculation. Every single night he brought me the bottle and stood over me as the drops fell. He even approached my department chair twice, suggesting that my teaching load for the upcoming semester should be scaled back. At a tech networking dinner around that time, I felt his hand rest gently on my back as he told an investor, in the perfectly restrained, grieving tone of a devoted husband, that my health had taken a heartbreaking downturn. Everyone in that room received the signal exactly the way he intended. He was building his narrative while I was building my case. We sat across from each other at the dinner table every night, running parallel simulations. I logged every single one of his reminders. Every time Julian mentioned my medication, I wrote the exact timestamp down in a physical notebook hidden behind a dusty assembly language textbook on my office bookshelf, a place he wouldn't look if he had 100 years. Over the course of 14 days, he reminded me every single day, sometimes twice a night. Once after dinner, and if I didn't do it immediately, he would check again right before bed. That frequency isn't the behavior of a worried spouse. A caring husband reminds you once and trusts you. Julian was monitoring a poisoning schedule. 14 entries, each time-stamped, each described in the flat, unambiguous prose of a woman who knew exactly what constitutes evidence of malice aforethought. During that same stretch, I called Sarah, a trusted colleague and a brilliant mind in cybersecurity who has been a close friend for years. We spent 20 minutes talking about meaningless academic conference schedules, but toward the very end, I casually dropped Julian's name into the conversation. I listened intently to her reaction. There was a pause before she spoke. It was brief, controlled, the distinct hesitation of a cautious person deciding exactly how much information to volunteer. She went with a diplomatic answer, but that pause told me everything. She had wanted to say something else. I archived that detail in my mind and let it go. I want to be completely honest about the toll those 2 weeks took. Performing dementia in front of the man who is actively trying to destroy your brain is not a neutral experience. It requires you to act like you are shrinking inside your own home, even as your mind is sharpening its knives. Some mornings I would stand in front of the bathroom mirror looking at my reflection, and I'd have to remind myself that the woman looking back wasn't the person he thought he was watching. She was something entirely different, a lethal vulnerability in his algorithm that he hadn't accounted for. Then, one evening, Julian looked up from his phone and told me he had set up a dinner. A merger and acquisitions consultant from Chicago was in town. He said her name was Elena Rostova. I had 3 days until my meeting with Victoria, my litigation attorney, and 5 days until that dinner. I weaponized every single hour. I started with the perimeters I could already access. Public tax records, offline databases, federal corporate filings, the kind of places a university professor with high-level systems access can navigate without raising a single red flag. At 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, I dropped Elena Rostova's name into my first tracking script. I didn't stop until I had unraveled as much of her identity as the digital world would yield. The breakthrough didn't happen all at once. It came in layers, like an onion. One document led to another. A tax filing pointed to an offshore corporate entity, which led to a shell company, which ultimately looped right back to Julian. It's the kind of data trail that looks entirely like a series of coincidences until you zoom out far enough to see the architecture. Elena wasn't some consultant he had crossed paths with recently. She was a shadow director with ultimate signing authority in 2 under-the-radar holding companies owned by Julian. Those were the exact 2 entities designed to absorb the rights to my Aegis protocol through a series of interlocking legal agreements. Her involvement wasn't new either. The earliest financial signature I could link to her name went back 7 years into our marriage. Julian had been working with Elena, building a massive framework for asset diversion, for nearly a third of the time we had been married. While I was teaching advanced security seminars, publishing patents, dealing with my failing eyes, and completely trusting the man across the table, he was building a partnership with another woman that went far deeper than anything he had ever admitted to me. I pulled everything I could legally access: joint tax returns, property deeds, and the original trust structures connected to my intellectual property. I printed them out and lined my desk with them, treating them like malicious code. I went slow, fully absorbed, looking for anomalies in the logic rather than rushing to conclusions. The signatures of a breach stood out instantly. The same shell companies kept appearing. The same offshore routing numbers surfaced where they had no business being. Several authorization forms Julian had asked me to sign years ago under the guise of tax optimization suddenly looked a lot less routine than I remembered. I couldn't map the entire financial heist yet, but I knew I was no longer looking at standard business operations. The deeper I went, the more impossible it became to ignore one glaring truth. Elena wasn't on the periphery of Julian's professional life. She was at the center of it. The earliest document linking her to those entities was dated 7 years ago. 7 years. I sat with that number for a long time. 7 years ago, I was building my academic reputation, adjusting to my eye diagnosis, and deeply in love with a man I thought was building a life with me. 7 years ago, Elena's name was already stamped right next to his. There was one document that held my attention longer than the rest. It was an internal corporate amendment filed 6 years back. On the execution page, Elena's signature sat directly beside Julian's, not as a witness, not as an administrative contact, but as a co-approver with ultimate veto power. I read that page 3 times. In business, you don't give someone that level of access by accident. You do it because you desperately need them inside the core system. I moved that document to the front of my encrypted folder. I want to describe exactly what it feels like when that kind of clarity hits. It wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier, cleaner, louder, an emotion I could process and move past. What I felt was much colder. It was a settling. The absolute stillness that comes when a fatal system vulnerability stops being a hypothesis and becomes a fully documented, reproducible exploit. I still didn't have the complete picture of the trust structures he was using to divert my patents. I knew that, and I knew I needed expertise that went beyond my own skill set. That's why Victoria was vital. That's why Marcus, my patent attorney, was vital. Just before midnight, a routine annual disclosure form tied to one of Julian's minor shell companies scraped into my search script. Elena's name appeared yet again. Same registered address, same corporate registered agents, same network of diverted funds. By then, the pattern was mathematically undeniable. This wasn't a consultant moving through Julian's life. This was a woman he had systematically coded into his back doors years ago. I transferred everything I found onto a physical encrypted drive and shut down my computer. At 11 at night, Julian walked into the study. He kissed my forehead and reminded me to take my eye drops. I looked at him and told him I loved him. It was the last time I would ever say those words, and the moment they left my mouth, I knew it with absolute certainty. I took that drive straight to Victoria's office. When I walked out, I had a lethal strategy in hand. Victoria's office sat at the top of a downtown Austin high-rise. It was all sharp lines and minimal decor, the kind of space that tells you the person inside doesn't waste time on anything that doesn't matter. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows when I walked in. She turned around, shook my hand, and pointed to the chair across from her desk. No small talk, didn't even offer me coffee. I liked her immediately. I plugged in the drive and laid out the evidence piece by piece. That day, I had this bizarre dream where everything was explicitly labeled as a work of fiction, but I still forced myself to read through the entire novel anyway. There was the legally recorded Russian audio from our home security camera. Texas is a one-party consent state, and Julian had signed off on installing those cameras in the shared areas of our house himself. Then there were the dates, the precise Russian medical terms, and that chilling laugh. I had the preliminary mass spectrometry report on the neurotoxins from my students. I had my encrypted health journal from the past 8 weeks, tracking the steady buildup of my cognitive decline symptoms. I had physical timestamps of the 14 specific times Julian forced me to take my medication. On top of that, there was my background check on Elena, her role in the offshore shell companies, and her 7-year financial entanglement with Julian. And finally, those patent trust documents that made me deeply suspicious, even if I couldn't fully decrypt them yet. I pulled up every single document on the screen, letting each one sink in before moving to the next. Victoria watched without saying a word. When she finished looking at the last file, she leaned back in her chair and just sat there in silence for a long time. Then she looked at me and said that if this evidence held up under further judicial review, we were dealing with something much bigger than a standard divorce lawsuit. I showed her the word-for-word transcript I made of the Russian audio. At the top, I included my professional credentials and the cryptographic and linguistic methods I used to transcribe it. She read it twice. Then she told me that a translation and verification from a tenured professor with 20 years of experience in cyber and information analysis would carry massive weight in a federal court. She also confirmed that under Texas law, the audio was completely legal to use. Then, she turned her attention back to the files. What caught her eye wasn't any single sentence, but how the whole loop closed perfectly. The mention of drugs, the timeline, the transfer of assets, and Julian's own words aligning perfectly with these hidden business documents. A single red flag is just a question mark, but when you weave them all together, it is a federal felony. She closed her laptop and looked at me with total seriousness, telling me exactly what I absolutely could not do next. I couldn't confront Julian. I couldn't change the pacing of my dementia act. I couldn't take any original paper documents from the house. And I couldn't contact Elena Rostova directly. I had to keep up the status quo perfectly, acting exactly like a victim on the verge of a breakdown, until the net we were casting snapped tight. I told her I already knew exactly how to play my part at the dinner table. She looked at me for a second and said she trusted me. The moment I left, Victoria contacted Marcus, the patent attorney. She told me later that the two of them started tag-teaming the case that very afternoon. 2 days later, by the time I sat down in that glass conference room, my two top-tier lawyers were already launching an invisible assault through the SEC and federal court channels. I walked into that meeting with my phone secretly recording and a full arsenal of facts in my head. I also had the backing of two professionals who knew we needed to deliver a fatal strike immediately. On the drive home, I felt something I hadn't felt since the moment I heard Julian's laugh in that hallway. I felt the weight on my back start to shift. It didn't vanish, but when you have two incredibly sharp, highly capable people carrying it with you, the weight changes shape. It stops feeling like an anvil crushing you and starts feeling like a fortress protecting you. I pulled into the driveway. Julian's car was already there. Before I even reached the porch, he opened the front door. "Where were you? You're not answering your phone," he asked, a subtle edge of anxiety creeping into his voice. "I got lost at school. Took forever to find my car," I replied, sounding vacant and exhausted. He nodded, sighed, and said he ordered takeout. I walked inside and set my bag down. 2 more days. At that meeting, that was when he expected to see a total victory. But I was still standing. The morning after my counterattack in Russian, I noticed a shift in him. A new kind of tension. It was the kind of panic bubbling right beneath the surface that an untrained observer would miss completely. But I was anything but an untrained observer. I had spent nearly 20 years studying human behavioral patterns when people try to hide their vulnerabilities. In the days following that meeting, Julian was under a specific kind of pressure, the lethal backlash of a perfect plan spinning off the rails. His timeline for the asset carve-out with Elena had already passed. Not only was I still showing up to work perfectly lucid, but I had also blindsided them at the conference table with fluent, native-level Russian. He couldn't comprehend where the system had broken down. His loyal husband programming was starting to run out of memory. First came the tiny shifts. He stopped proactively bringing me my liquid medication at night. It wasn't a sudden stop, but a gradual withdrawal over 3 days. I immediately recognized this as the behavior of a man forced to pivot toward internal defense. The fake warmth he had carefully maintained for weeks began to shrink into brief, stiff, transactional small talk. His sentences got shorter. When I asked about his day at work, he gave me one-word answers and went right back to his phone. The phone was the dead giveaway. It had always been near him before, but now it was glued to him. He took it into the bathroom. He kept it face down on the nightstand instead of charging it on the dresser like he had for years. He gripped it tightly even during breakfast. This wasn't just a habit anymore. It was high-alert paranoia. I logged every single change in his behavior. The date he stopped bringing the meds. The first night he took his phone into the bathroom. The morning he left 40 minutes earlier than usual without any explanation. Every single entry was time-stamped and written into the encrypted logbook in my office. Julian thought he was making slick personal adjustments, but to me they were just a running log of secondary criminal evidence. When a man runs out of patience, he starts making stupid decisions he would never allow if he were thinking straight. He was slipping up every single day, and I was recording all of it. During this time, Marcus called me. He was incredibly cautious over the phone. No specifics, no unnecessary labeling. He just told me that his preliminary audit of the Aegis Protocol trust documents had uncovered a fatal structural flaw. In one of the amendments, he found a non-consent legal mechanism, essentially a trigger to bypass me completely and transfer the patents directly. He wasn't ready to say too much before the full audit was finished, but he wanted me to know he was tracking it, and the loophole he saw was big enough to trigger direct SEC intervention. He would have the full forensic report within a week. I thanked him, hung up, and added it to the log. 1 line, date, time, summary. That was enough. Julian's professional firewall was crumbling in ways he clearly couldn't see. Elena Rostova's name started popping up on email CC lists where she had absolutely no business being. Scheduling, vendor communications, internal venture capital funds, emails deep within Julian's business empire that had nothing to do with the clearance of some supposed consultant from Chicago. Out of pure panic, he was forcing her into the management structure of his daily operations. The firewall he had built between his conspiracy and his real life was collapsing because he just didn't have the energy to maintain it anymore. Then, one night, he sat down at the dinner table and casually mentioned that he thought we should update our property trust documents, using the exact same tone you would use to say we need more milk. He said it so lightly, like the thought had just popped into his head. I looked at him across the table and, using a painfully slow, sluggish voice, said that sounded like a great idea and that I would call Marcus tomorrow. The look of relief on Julian's face didn't even last a full second, but I caught it. The next morning, while Julian was in the shower, I called Marcus from the bedroom. I told him about the conversation last night. Marcus told me, in no uncertain terms, absolutely do not sign anything. Then he let me know that the full forensic audit results were officially in. I didn't even need to give Victoria a final update yet, because Elena Rostova herself was about to hand us the perfect excuse. The Austin tech scene was hosting its annual South by Southwest 5 IP Executive Gala. Venture capital titans, tech elites, university think tanks, this kind of high society Texas gathering was the ultimate hub for maintaining old connections and locking down new deals. For 12 years, Julian had attended every single one of them as my husband. He worked the room effortlessly, knowing that FaceTime alone was a form of currency. And I attended as his wife, a tenured professor providing institutional credibility to back him up. We always arrived together. We always left together. It was a hard-coded setting in our system. That night, Julian changed the script, and there was no way I was going to miss it. He officially brought Elena as his +1. She was there as an international M&A consultant tied to one of his cutting-edge tech investments. On paper, the excuse was rock solid. Nobody would question it. But it wasn't her showing up that caught my attention. It was how relaxed he was around her. The strict discipline that had kept Elena hidden away in the shadows for years was starting to fray at the edges. When Julian introduced her to a few of his closest business partners, he let slip a level of familiarity that went way beyond her supposed job title. It wasn't obvious. To anyone not looking through a microscope, it would be totally invisible. But I was always looking through a microscope. Standing on the other side of the venue with a glass of club soda, I watched silently. During one introduction, Julian's hand rested on the small of Elena's back for just a split second. It was too brief to raise eyebrows, but long enough to confirm everything. Elena seamlessly accepted a business card from one of Julian's longtime partners with the easy familiarity of someone who already belonged. The three of them shared a knowing look, a look that was rehearsed, not the polite courtesy of a first meeting. Shuzhishang, these little data points meant nothing on their own, but put them together and you have a lethal Trojan horse. I discreetly took photos of everything I could with my phone. 3 separate high-def shots, all taken keeping the phone below chest level. The frames were clean and perfectly clear. The partner who handed Elena his card was the exact same name I had seen on Marcus's list of offshore shell companies. He wasn't just a business contact. His name appeared multiple times in the corporate structures trying to swallow my Aegis protocol. His familiarity with Elena confirmed exactly what Marcus's documents hinted at but couldn't outright prove. This gala wasn't some formal introduction. It was the physical manifestation of their criminal network. Before Julian realized I was missing, I left the venue. Sitting in my car in the parking lot, I sent the photos to Victoria along with a brief breakdown of what I had just witnessed. A few minutes later, her reply came through. "Interesting, let's talk tomorrow morning." Those 5 words told me more than a novel ever could. I drove home. Julian arrived 40 minutes later, completely relaxed, looking like a man whose night went exactly according to script. He walked over and told me I looked beautiful tonight. He said it naturally, with a touch of the warmth he had been carefully withholding since the crisis at the meeting. I thanked him, said I was exhausted, and went to bed. I lay there in the dark, thinking about that Russian word for carve-out. I thought about the man walking around in the next room, the man who had used that word at a conference table to plot the end of my life, my patents, and everything I had ever worked for, only to come home and tell me I was beautiful. It made me realize how language betrays people when they think they are protected by absolute security protocols. It exposes everything. It always does. I thought about the storm that was about to hit, and I closed my eyes. A few weeks after the gala photo incident, Victoria called me into her office. She didn't explain why over the phone. She didn't need to. The vibration in her voice was that of a woman holding a lethal weapon, eager to hand it over in person. As I sat across from her desk, she told me that the audio file had been restored using forensic-grade noise reduction. The white noise in the conference room that had muffled the details was no longer an issue. What emerged from the cleanup was a pristine, complete ironclad record of every single word Julian and Elena had spoken at that table, from the moment Julian switched to Russian to the exact second I set my water glass down. She slid the printed transcript across the desk, showing the restored translation side by side with my initial word-for-word copy. Weeks ago, I had submitted my transcription in my professional capacity. Now, an independent, court-certified translator with a federal security clearance had verified it against the enhanced audio. There were 0 material differences, not a single disputed phrase. What I had written down line by line at my desk on the night of that meeting, using a language I had lived and breathed for years, was confirmed by an independent professional to be absolutely accurate. Victoria explained what this meant in practical terms. In this case, I was no longer just the victim. I was also the undeniable expert witness. By choosing to run his conspiracy protocol in a language he thought I couldn't understand, Julian had handed me the source code to destroy him, signed with his own voice. The recording didn't just prove intent, it provided hyper-specific execution details. He named the exact synthetic neuroinhibitor he was using to poison me. It matched perfectly with the components my student had analyzed in the independent lab. The takeover timeline he mentioned aligned seamlessly with the 8-week symptom buildup documented in my medical files. On top of that, he used the phrase Aegis proxy, a covert internal code name that didn't exist in any public documents and couldn't be known by anyone who wasn't directly involved in the restructuring plot. This detail pinned Julian right at the center of the criminal chain, leaving him with no room to hide behind excuses like a failed investment or accidental ignorance. Combined with everything Marcus had dug up in the financial audit, it completed the final link in the chain of evidence. Then Victoria brought up Elena. In the weeks following the initial subpoenas and investigative demands, Elena Rostova had hired her own defense attorney. She and Julian were no longer sharing legal representation. Victoria carefully explained the weight of this move. Elena hiring an independent lawyer didn't automatically mean she was turning state's evidence, but in a federal conspiracy case, it instantly shifted the entire landscape of the battlefield. Whatever story Julian planned to fabricate, he would now have to face the music alone without the protection of a unified front. The financial scope of the case had also exploded. What began as a routine review of trust documents and local property records had expanded to the federal level as more data was intercepted. Several of Julian's shell companies operated across state lines. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division and forensic accountants from the SEC were now matching asset restructuring documents and money laundering transfers against a massive, growing database. Victoria was careful not to overstate things. There were no final conclusions yet. No arrest warrants had been issued. But enough red flags had gone up that federal agencies outside the original investigation were taking over the files within their respective jurisdictions. Julian's business empire was no longer being examined by Texas businessmen who knew and respected him. It was being dissected under a microscope by cold, data-driven federal auditors who didn't care who he was. Sitting in that office, I felt an emotion I didn't expect. It wasn't relief exactly, but something quieter and much more indestructible. I had started this with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear, and a drop of eye medicine with the wrong viscosity. I built the case document by document, logged it timestamp by timestamp, and decoded it word by word. What it had finally grown into was something far larger than anything I could have built on my own. Victoria told me that federal agents were preparing to move into the next phase of the case. She told me that when certain actions took place, I shouldn't be at home. She suggested I go somewhere peaceful, somewhere where I could easily answer my phone. I thought of Sarah's office, the chair across from her desk, the morning light coming through her window. I knew exactly where I needed to go. On Tuesday morning, I woke up before Julian. Just as I had for the past several weeks, I got up early, not out of anxiety, but out of precision. I made espresso. I moved around the kitchen at my usual pace. I set his mug next to the coffee maker, exactly like I always did. All my movements remained at the same frequency. Just like every morning before, he watched me move around the house, fully believing I was sinking rapidly into the depths of dementia. I wasn't sinking. I was evacuating. 相关内容，我的随身包已经在我的车里了。我10分3天整理好的，每次只拿一件物品，极其小心。任何朱利安会注意到从原位消失的东西，我都没碰。一个为了生存而表演了数周正常的女人，清楚地知道如何在不轰发任何警报的情况下清空自己的生活。我学会了对自己的需求精确到极点，在那驱使又做到完全银行。My go bag was already in my car. I had packed it over the course of 3 days, moving just one item at a time with extreme care. I didn't touch anything Julian would notice missing from its usual spot. A woman who had spent weeks performing normalcy just to survive knew exactly how to hollow out her life without tripping a single alarm. I had learned to be mathematically precise about what I needed and completely invisible while taking it. Sarah's guest room in the Austin suburbs had been ready for me since Sunday. Julian didn't know. Julian didn't know almost any part of the truth about what was happening this morning. Before I left, I kissed his cheek. He was half asleep, instinctively reaching for his phone before he even sat up. I told him I had an early morning seminar. He grunted in agreement, not even forming a full word. I grabbed my coat, walked out the front door, and took the exact same route to campus that I drove every single morning. I went straight to Sarah's office. I sat in the chair across from her desk, set my coffee down, and opened a stack of graduate system architecture designs that I needed to grade. Sarah was already at her desk when I arrived. She took one look at me, read everything she needed to read, and opened her own laptop. We just sat there together in the kind of quiet unique to two women who understand that some mornings require presence, not words. It was 9:08 a.m. I know the exact time because I wrote it down. At the other end of the city, federal agents and Austin police were executing a comprehensive search warrant on the entire office building of Julian's venture capital fund. I wasn't there. I didn't watch it happen. I was grading a student's paper on zero-day exploits in enterprise paralysis, writing notes in the margins with my usual handwriting. Julian called at 9:14 a.m. I watched his name flash on the screen and didn't answer. He called again at 9:31 a.m. and again at 9:47 a.m. At 9:52 a.m. I hit answer. I told him I was at school. I told him I'd see him after work. My voice sounded exactly the same as it had on countless mornings over the past 12 years of talking to him. Steady, gentle, giving him absolutely nothing to work with. He said, okay. I hung up and went back to the architecture diagram. Before he tried calling me back, he called his criminal defense attorney. I found that out later. That move told me everything about the nature of the collapse he was experiencing in that building across town. When his system started falling apart, his first instinct wasn't to check on his wife. It was to find cover. Some things prove themselves without needing a single word of commentary. Around noon, Sarah brought back lunch. We ate and talked about the department's course scheduling for the next semester, even though neither of us was actually paying attention to it. At one point, she reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine, saying nothing. I nodded. That was the whole exchange, and it was enough. I spent the rest of the afternoon grading papers. Those young minds were writing about systems, about failures, about the lethality of code when used with precision. Meanwhile, across town in an interrogation room at the Federal Building, the Russian words Julian had arrogantly thrown around in that glass conference room were being read aloud into the official record by federal investigators with the power to subpoena and arrest. I found a quiet kind of perfection in that symmetry, a total lethal perfection. At 3:47 p.m., my phone screen lit up. It was a text from Victoria. Just 3 words. Got it all. I put down my red pen. I looked out Sarah's window at the Austin afternoon. The sunlight hit at that slanted angle unique to Texas evenings, turning a slow, deliberate amber. I breathed out. For the first time in weeks, I really breathed out. The collapse didn't happen with dramatic screaming. It unfolded with the cold finality of administrative procedure, which made it completely irreversible. I had studied the underlying logic of systems long enough to know that the most devastating fractures never happen with a loud bang. They always show up in the most ordinary formats. A brief internal email, a terminated investment agreement, a name quietly scrubbed from a letterhead. The noise of a dramatic meltdown gives people room to react and take sides. The silence of administrative procedure leaves absolutely no room for anyone, leaving behind nothing but a done deal. Julian's world ended in the icy language of official correspondence, and I read every single word of it with the focus of a person who had spent her entire life trying to understand systems. Even before any criminal indictments were made public, the shift in power had already begun. First, he was removed from the Texas Tech Innovation Board. It was a one-sentence email, brief, polite, the classic PR language of an institution cutting ties immediately to save itself while pretending to offer dignity. He was stepping back for personal reasons. Just one sentence, no elaboration. I read everything it left unsaid, which was exactly where the real meaning lived. His biggest financial partner was the next to go. The notice freezing their joint venture accounts was worded with extreme restraint. Any outsider reading it would have thought it was just a temporary compliance check. It was anything but temporary. Masking a permanent severance as a routine pause is a very precise legal tactic, and I recognized the underlying execution code instantly. The 2 venture capital partners who had been shaking hands with Elena Rostova at the tech gala stopped taking Julian's calls. The Austin business community didn't gather to issue some grand moral condemnation. It just routed around him like a failing node, with maximum efficiency and zero ceremony. The moment the cost of being associated with a person outweighs the value they bring to the table, the capital system executes its subtraction with absolute precision. A few days later, Victoria called me in the afternoon with an update. The tech mogul who had been making small talk with Elena at the gala, the man whose name kept appearing on the documents of those hidden holding companies, had gone to the FBI on his own initiative. I asked her how long they had known each other. 15 years, Victoria said. I remember looking out my office window at the campus lawn when she told me that number. 15 years. That was longer than my marriage. Long enough to build a business empire together. Long enough to trade countless backroom favors. Long enough to make you believe that when standing next to you becomes incredibly expensive, a man will still stand by your side. But he didn't. According to Victoria, the meeting was highly productive. That was the exact word she used, productive. I knew exactly how much weight that word carried in a plea deal. It showed me precisely the kind of algorithm Julian's lifelong loyalties were built on, a formula that only runs successfully when the cost of maintaining it is lower than the cost of betrayal. The exact second that math flips, 15 years of history means less than a line of dead code. A few months later, when the criminal indictments were officially filed, everything became public record. Wire fraud, attempted first-degree murder, and interstate conspiracy. Those 3 heavy felonies dragged Julian's name into a dead zone that no amount of slick PR could pull him out of. The tech blogs broke the news within hours. The story circulating was no longer the one he had spent 12 years carefully crafting. He was no longer the devoted husband protecting his sick wife, the philanthropic investor, or the successful Texas Tech golden boy. The story people were reading now was the one contained on a physically encrypted drive. It was the story I had personally written, timestamp by timestamp, and it was a much more accurate version. By that time, Elena Rostova had already completely cut herself loose from Julian's world. Working through her own high-powered defense team, she focused entirely on managing her own legal exposure and completely withdrew from the defensive matrix they used to share. She didn't issue any public statements, nor did she cooperate in a way that directly benefited the prosecution. She did something much simpler and much more lethal. She just stopped functioning. She stopped defending him, stopped covering for him, and stopped moving assets. She left Julian standing there completely alone to prop up a fake narrative that had required two people to maintain from the very beginning. That afternoon, Victoria called again. The court had accepted the divorce filing, and Julian had been served with the papers. I only asked one question: how long until the final decree? She gave me a timeline. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Marcus. I told him I was ready to finalize the distribution of the intellectual property. The last time I sat across from Julian, it wasn't in a high-end corporate boardroom or in our old living room. It was on a Thursday morning, inside a mediator's office under harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. A court reporter sat in the corner, her hands resting flat on her machine, waiting with a completely blank expression. Over a year had passed since my counterattack in Russian. There were no dramatic sparks left in this room, no lingering regrets hanging in the air. The temperature of the room belonged to a place where everything was already dead and buried, and only the accounting was left. Every single person sitting at that table knew it. Julian's lawyer understood exactly how brutal the terrain was the moment he walked through the door. By then, the federal criminal process was moving forward relentlessly. Every offshore account record had been dissected from every angle. The trust documents used to manipulate my patents had been reviewed, challenged, and completely dismantled. As time went on, the chain of evidence against him didn't fall apart. It just locked down tighter. When you represent a man facing fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder charges, and when the documentary evidence against your client keeps piling up like an avalanche, you don't have many cards left to play. The only real question left was the math between how much your client would lose in an out-of-court settlement versus how much he would destroy himself if he let everything go to a jury. Julian's lawyer advised him to settle in exchange for my silence on the civil side. Julian broke. That was the entire scope of the mediation. It was a corporate execution where everyone in the room had already agreed on the outcome. I walked away with total ownership and control over all the patents for the Aegis protocol. Every single joint signature authorization Julian had spent 7 years meticulously setting up had been completely incinerated by Marcus long before we ever sat down in those chairs. The underlying architecture was sealed back up, completely intact, without a single scratch from any of their fraudulent filings. I was awarded the vast majority of Julian's remaining legitimate business assets that hadn't been frozen by the feds, the shares that could be liquidated under the settlement agreement. He was ordered to cover every single dime of the legal and investigative fees. The Austin House, a place I never wanted to set foot in again, would be put on the market, and the split of the proceeds perfectly reflected the violent reason this marriage had ended. And I kept my current last name. I didn't keep it as a remnant of Julian's existence, but as a professional brand that I had spent 20 years building in international academia and tech circles. It belonged entirely to me now, completely separate from how I got it. During the entire mediation, Julian didn't look at me once, not a single time. He looked at the papers his lawyer pushed in front of him. He looked at the white wall just behind my head. He looked at the court reporter in the corner, at the ceiling, and at the edge of the mahogany table. He looked anywhere except my face. He mechanically signed every single document handed to him without saying a word. When the last page was signed, he stood up, his hands instinctively reaching to button his suit jacket. The movement was so practiced and automatic that, on a man who had just lost every ounce of power he ever had, it looked like the final twitch of dead muscle memory. Even after every real defense had crumbled, that pathetic layer of vanity kept running on autopilot. He walked out without saying a word. The door clicked shut behind him. The sound of the latch catching was quiet, but it had the finality of a gavel striking a block. I recorded that moment in my mind with the exact same precision I had used to parse all the data over the last year. He didn't look at me once, not even at the very end. I filed that detail away into my memory just like any other piece of evidence. Not as a point of sadness, but strictly as data. One final truth about that man, logged for the last time. After Julian left, Marcus walked me through the final transfer documents. Every corrected declaration, every predatory clause stripped away. It confirmed that the system I had spent half my life building was completely secure. He was thorough and precise. When he finished, I thanked him, and he left too. I sat alone in that sterile room for a few minutes, staring at the manila folder full of signed documents on the table in front of me. There was no more need to perform, no more need to run any counterintelligence operations, no more parsing the lethal logic hidden beneath everyday words. It was just me, sitting in that room. It was over. I didn't feel any conventional sense of euphoria or triumph. What I felt was something much deeper and quieter. It didn't have a specific name, but it settled heavy inside my chest, like something you didn't even realize you had lost finally sliding back into place. I felt like myself again. I picked up the folder, put on my trench coat, and walked out of the high-rise into the Austin sunshine. This afternoon there was absolutely nothing left for me to calculate. Before I even reached my car, my phone rang. It was one of my students, the girl who had handled the neurotoxin analysis, asking a complicated question about an encryption mechanism for some low-level code. I answered the call. We talked about firewalls and system logic all the way through my drive home. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, I walked back into my lecture hall. It was the third week after the settlement went into effect. The exact same classroom, the same chair behind the podium, and the same stack of classic defense architecture textbooks I had been teaching from for 15 years. The graduate students filed in just like they always did, opening their laptops before they even sat down, leaving rings of condensation from their coffee cups on the wooden desks, their low chatter continuing whatever conversations they had started in the hallway. None of them knew what had really happened. They only knew I had been on a long medical leave, and they knew I was back now. One or two of them looked at me with that specific kind of caution unique to young people trying to gauge if a professor they respect is truly okay without wanting to ask directly. I didn't give them a single reason to worry. I gave them the raw truth they needed to learn. I taught that advanced seminar exactly the way I always had. There was no theatrical performance, no emotional outpourings. There was only the absolute precision that comes when you are completely fluent in the domain you've dedicated your life to. The topic of the lecture was a concept I return to every year because it never ages. The power of code and language as weapons, their nature as ironclad evidence, and how they function as the ultimate mechanism to expose the most hidden intentions, regardless of whether the operator thinks they've erased their tracks. I had been teaching those concepts in that exact room for 15 years, and I had always believed them. But that morning, I spoke with a completely different kind of weight. It was the weight of a woman who had just taken that theory into a brutal, real-world conflict and survived. I told them that no information exchange within any system can ever be absolutely neutral. Every piece of code typed into an encrypted channel that a hacker believes is perfectly secure is still a piece of code. It remains a criminal signature left behind by the brain that created it. It can be tracked, it can be recovered, and in every single sense, it stands as ironclad evidence that can be brought into a courtroom. I told them that silence itself is a highly advanced programming language. The decision to remain unresponsive is an action just as clear as entering any other command, and a true master of the system completely understands both. I told them that a woman who has mastered all the underlying languages and backdoors of a system will never be the weakest node in that room. I didn't provide any context, no explanations, and zero clues that would allow them to connect these words to the slaughter I had just survived. I simply spoke these words calmly, carrying the specific gravity I had given them that morning. I didn't need to explain it. The logic carried its own weight. It always does. Sarah was sitting in the very back row of the lecture hall. Every now and then she would come audit my seminar. We had kept up this habit for years, sitting in each other's classrooms, the way academics do when they need to remind themselves why they chose this path in the first place. She had heard me teach this chapter before, but I could tell from her incredibly quiet posture that she had never heard me teach it like this. Throughout the entire lecture, she sat there with a completely blank expression. When I wrote the final equation on the chalkboard and ended the lecture, she caught my eye from across the room and gave me a tiny nod. It wasn't approval, it was an acknowledgement of pure awe. I received it, turned around, and closed my lecture notes. Julian's criminal trial was still moving forward relentlessly. The federal lawsuit naming both Julian and Elena Rostova as co-defendants was deep in a fierce discovery phase. Elena was trying to manage her damage control remotely from overseas through her American attorneys, but the distance did absolutely nothing to lessen her legal liability in the fraud chain. The entire offshore financial network Julian had spent 7 years building was completely frozen under the scrutiny of the Department of Justice. The tech board that had once sent him that brief email had long since found someone else to fill his seat. Austin had routed around his absence with extreme efficiency, just as massive systems always do. No drama, no lingering memories, only the absolute ruthless efficiency of an institution surviving by cleaning house. They have zero loyalty to individuals. I dismissed the class. I watched my students pack up their backpacks and head for the door, carrying their notes, their questions, and their entirely unwritten futures. Sarah stayed in her seat until the very last student left. Then she stood up. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. Together we walked out of the lecture hall, through the corridors, and out of the building, stepping into the piercing Austin sunshine. Systems and language have never been just tools for communication. In the hands of someone who knows how to use them, they are the most lethal scalpels a human being can hold.